Chapter 2, The Coming of the English, by Charles Oman. In the early half of the 5th century, it seemed likely that Britain would become the prey of its old enemies the Picts and Scots, rather than of the more distant Saxons. But the wild tribes of the north came to plunder only, while the pirates from the Elbe and Eider had larger designs. The conquest of Britain by the Angles and Saxons differed in every way from that of the other western provinces of the Roman Empire, by the kindred tribes of the Goths, the Franks, and the Lombards. The Goths and the Franks had dwelt for 200 years on the borders of the empire. They had traded with its merchants, served as mercenaries in its armies, and learnt to appreciate its luxuries. Many of them had accepted Christianity long before their conquest of the provinces, which they turned into Teutonic kingdoms. But the Saxons were plunged in the blackest heathendom and barbarism, dwelling as they did by the Elbe and Eider, far at the back of the tribes that had any touch with or knowledge of the empire and its civilization. The Goth and the Frank came to enslave and to enjoy. The Angle and the Saxon were bent purely on a work of destruction. Hence it came that, instead of contenting themselves with overthrowing the provincial government and enthralling the inhabitants of the land, they swept away everything before them and replaced the old civilization of Britain by a perfectly new social organization of their own. If the Welsh legends speak truly, the first settlement of the Saxons on British soil was caused by the unwisdom of the native kings. We are told that Vortigern, the monarch who ruled Kent and southeastern Britain, was so harried by the Picts and Scots that he sent in despair to hire some German chiefs to fight his battles for him. The story may be true, for in the decaying days of the Roman Empire, the PG-15 Caesars themselves had often hired one barbarian to fight another, and the British king may well have followed their example. The legend then proceeds to tell how Vortigern's invitation was accepted by Hengist and Horsa, two chiefs of Jutish blood, who came with their warbands to the aid of the Britons, and drove away the Picts and Scots. But when the king of Kent wished to pay them their due and get them out of the country, Hengist and Horsa refused to depart. They seized and fortified the Isle of Thanet, which was then separated from the mainland by a broad marshy channel, and defied the Britons to drive them away. 449. Then began a long war between the two sea kings and their late employer, which, after many vicissitudes, ended in the conquest of the whole of Kent by Hengist. Horsa had been slain in the Battle of Aylesford, which gave the invaders full possession of the land between the Forest of the Weald and the estuary of the Thames. Hengist was saluted as king by his victorious followers, and was the ancestor of a long line of Kentish monarchs. We cannot be sure that the details of the story of the conquest of Kent are correct, but they are not unlikely, and it is quite probable that this kingdom was the first state which the Germans built up on British ground. Hengist and Horsa's warriors were not Saxons, but members of the tribe of the Jutes, who dwelt north of the Saxons in the Danish peninsula, where a land of moors and lakes still bears the name of Jutland. But the next band of invaders who seized on part of Britain were of Saxon blood. An alderman or chief called Aelle brought his warband to the southern shore of Britain in 477 and landed near the great fortress of Anderida Pevensey, one of the strongholds that had, in old days, been under the care of the Roman Count of the Saxon shore. The followers of Aelle sacked this town and slew off every living thing that was therein. They went on to conquer the narrow slip of land between the sea and the Forest of the Weald, as far as Chichester and Selsey, and made the chalky downs their own. Settling down thereon, they called themselves the South Saxons, and the district got from them the name of Sussex South-Seeks. Their Aelle reigned as king, and many of his obscure descendants after him. 20 years later, another band of Saxon adventurers, led by the alderman Cerdic, landed on Southampton Water, west of the realm of Aelle 495, and after a hard fight with the Britons, won the valleys of the Itchen and the Test with the old Roman town of Venta Winchester. Many years after his first landing, Cerdic took the title of king, like his neighbours of Kent and Sussex, and his realm became known as the land of the West Saxons, Wessex. Gradually pushing onward along the ridges of the Downs, successive generations of the kings of Wessex drove the Britons out of Dorsetshire and Wiltshire, till the line of conquest stopped at the forest belt, which lay east of Bath. Here the advance stood still for a time, for the British kings of the Damnonians, the tribes of Devon and Cornwall, made a most obstinate defense. So gallant was it that the Celts of a later generation believed that the legendary hero of their race, the great King Arthur, had headed the hosts of Damnonia in person, and placed his city of Camelot and his grave at Avilion within the compass of the Western realm. While Cerdic was winning the Downs of Hampshire for himself, another band of Saxon warriors had landed on the northern shore of the Thames and subdued the low-lying country between the old Roman towns of Camulogenum and Londinium, from the colony as far as the Stour. This troop of adventurers took the name of the East Saxons and were the last of their race to gain a footing on the British shores. North of Essex, it was no longer the Saxons who took up the task of conquest, but a kindred tribe, the Angles or English, who dwelt originally between the Saxons and the Jutes, in the district which is now called Schleswig. They were closely allied in blood and language to the earlier invaders of Britain, and very probably their chiefs may have aided in the earlier raids. About the year 520, the Angles descended in force on the eastern shore of Britain, and two of their warbands established themselves in the land where the Celtic tribe of the Iceni had dwelt. These two bands called themselves the North Folk and South Folk, and from them, the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk get PG-17 their names. The kingdom formed by their union was known as that of the East Angles. Still further to the north, New Anglian bands seized on the lands north of the Humber, whence they obtained the name of Northumbrians. They built up two kingdoms in the old region of the Brigantes. One, from Forth to Tees, was called Bernicia, from Brynich, the old Celtic name of the district. It comprised only a strip along the shore, reaching no further inland than the forest of Selkirk and the headwaters of the Tyne. Its central stronghold was the sea-girt rock of Bamborough. The second Northumbrian kingdom was called Dara, a name derived, like that of Bernicia, from the former Celtic appellation of the land. Dara comprised the north and east ridings of Yorkshire, and centered round the old Roman city of Eboracum, whose name the Angles corrupted into Eofervic. The origin of Bernicia and Dara is ascribed to the years 547–550, so that northern Britain was not subdued by the invaders till a century after Kent had fallen into their hands. Last of the English realms was established the great Midland state of Mercia, the March or borderland. It was formed by the combination of 3 or 4 Anglian warbands, who must have cut their way into the heart of Britain up the line of the Trent. Among these bodies of adventurers were the Lindiswaras, the troop who had won the old Roman city of Lindum, or Lincoln, the Mid-Angles of Leicester, and the Mercians strictly so called, who held the foremost line of advance against the Celts in the modern counties of Derby and Stafford. The Britons still maintained themselves at Deva and Uriconium, Chester, and Wroxeter, 2 ancient Roman strongholds, and the Mercians had not yet reached the Severn at any point. About 570, therefore, after 120 years of hard fighting, the Angles and Saxons had conquered about one half of Britain, but they were stopped by a line of hills and forests running down the center of the island, and did not yet touch the western sea at any point. Behind this barrier dwelt the unsubdued Britons, who were styled by the English the Welsh, or foreigners, though they called themselves the Cymry, or comrades. They were, now PG-18 as always, divided into several kingdoms whose chiefs were perpetually at war, and failed most lamentably to support each other against the English invader. The most important of these kingdoms were Cumbria in the north, between the Clyde and Ribble, Gwynedd in North Wales, and Damnonia in Devon and Cornwall. Now and again prominent chiefs from one or other of these 3 realms succeeded in forcing their neighbors to combine against the Saxon enemy, and styled themselves lords of all the Britons, but the title was precarious and illusory. The Celts could never learn union or wisdom. The line of the British defense was at last broken in 2 points, and the Saxons and Angles pushed through till they touched the Irish Sea and the Bristol Channel. The first of the conquerors of western Britain was Ceawlin, King of Wessex. After winning the southern Midlands by a victory at Bedford in 571, he pushed along the upper Thames and attacked the Welsh of the lower Severn. At a great battle fought at Dioram, in Gloucestershire, in 577, he slew the kings of Glevum, Corinium, and Aquisules, Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath. All their realms fell into his hands, PG-19, and so the West Saxons won their way to the Severn and the Bristol Channel, and cut off the Celts of Damnonia from the Celts of South Wales. A generation later, in the year 613, Ethelfrith the Northumbrian, king of Bernicia and Dara, made a similar advance westward. In a great battle at Deva, Chester, he defeated the allied princes of Cumbria and North Wales. This fight was long remembered because of the massacre of a host of monks who had come to supplicate heaven for the victory of the Celts over the pagan English. "If they do not fight against us with their arms, they do so with their prayers," said the Northumbrian king, and bade his warriors cut them all down. The city of Deva was sacked, and remained a mere ring of mouldering Roman walls for 3 centuries. The district round it became English, and thus the Cumbrians were separated from the North Welsh by a belt of hostile territory. The battles of Chester and Dioram settled the future of Britain. The Celts became comparatively helpless when they had been cut into 3 distinct sections, in Cumbria, Wales, and Damnonia. The future of the island now lay in the hands of the English, not in that of the ancient inhabitants of Britain. The states which the invaders had built up were, as might have been inferred from their origin, small military monarchies. The basis of each had been the warband that followed some successful aldermen, for the invaders were not composed of whole tribes emigrating en masse, but of the more adventurous members of the race only. The bulk of the Saxons and Jutes remained behind on the continent in their ancient homes, and so did many of the Angles. When the successful chief had conquered a district of Britain and assumed the title of king, he would portion the land out among his followers, reserving a great share for his own royal domain. Each of the king's sworn companions, or Jesseths as the Old English called them, became the center of a small community of dependents, his children, servants, and slaves. At first the invaders often slew off the whole Celtic population of a valley, but ere long they found the convenience of reducing them to slavery and forcing them to till the land for their new masters. In eastern Britain, and during the first days of the conquest, the natives were often wholly extirpated, but in the PG-20 Central, and still more in the western part of the island, they were allowed to survive as serfs, and thus there is much Celtic blood in England down to this day. But this native element was never strong enough to prevail over and absorb the conquerors, as happened to the Goths of Spain and the Franks of Gaul, who finally lost their language and their national identity among the preponderant mass of their own dependents. As the conquest of Britain went on, many families who had not been in the warband of the original invader came in to join the first settlers, and to dwell among them, so that the king had many English subjects besides his original Jesseths. Some of the villages in his dominions would therefore be inhabited by the servile dependents of one of these early-coming military chiefs, others by the free bands of kinsmen who had drifted in of their own accord to settle in the land. When we see an English village with a name like Saxmundham, or Edmonton, or Wolverton, we may guess that the place was originally the homestead of a lord named Saxmund, or Eadmund, or Wulfher, and his dependents. But when it has a name like Buckingham, or Paddington, or Gillingham, we know that it was the common settlement of a family, the Buckings, or the Paddings, or the Gillings, for the termination ing in Old English invariably implied a body of descendants from common ancestors. The early English states were administered under the king by aldermen, or military chiefs, to each of whom was entrusted the government of one of the various regions of the kingdom, and by reeves, who were responsible for the royal property and dues, each in his own district. The larger kingdoms, such as Wessex, were soon cut up into shires, each with its alderman and shireeve sheriff, and many of these shires exist down to our own day. The supreme council of the realm was formed by the king, the aldermen, and a certain number of the greater Jesseths who served about the king's person. The king and great men discussed subjects of national moment, while the people sat round and shouted assent or dissent to their speeches. The king did not take any measure of importance without the advice of his counselors, who were known as the witan, or wise men. When a king died, or ruled tyrannically, or became incompetent, it was the witan who chose a new PG-21 monarch from among the members of the royal family, for there was as yet no definite rule of hereditary succession, and the kingship was elective, though the witan never went outside the limits of the royal house in their nominations. The smaller matters of import in an Old English kingdom were settled at the shiremoot, or meeting of all the freemen of a shire. There, once a month, the aldermen and reeve of the district called up the freeholders who dwelt in it, and by their aid settled disputes and lawsuits. Each freeman had his vote, so the shire court was a much more democratic body than the witan, where only great lords and officials could speak and give their suffrages. Matters too small for the shiremoot were settled by the meeting of the villagers in their own petty tun-moot, which every freeman would attend. Here would be decided disputes between neighbors, as to their fields and cattle. Such cases would be numerous because, in the early settlements of the English, the plowed fields and the pasture grounds of the village were both great unenclosed tracts with no permanent boundaries. Every man owned his house and yard, but the pasture and the waste land and woods around belonged to the community and not to the individual. The early English were essentially dwellers in the open country. They did not at first know how to deal with the old Roman towns, but simply plundered and burnt them, and allowed them to crumble away. They thought the deserted ruins were the homes of ghosts and evil spirits, and were not easily induced to settle near them. Even great towns like Canterbury and London and Bath seem to have lain waste for a space, between their destruction by the first invaders and their being again peopled. But ere long the advantages of the sites, and the abundance of building material, which the old Roman buildings supplied, tempted the English back to the earlier centers of population. We can trace the ancient origin of many of our towns by their names. The English added the word Chester or Castor to the name of the places which were built on Roman sites, a word derived, of course, from the Latin castra. So Winchester and Rochester and Dorchester and Lancaster are shown to be old Roman towns rebuilt, but not founded by the newcomers. In religion, the Old English were pure polytheists, worshipping the ancient gods of their German ancestors, Woden, the wise father of heaven, and thunder Thor, the god of storm and strength, and Balder, the god of youth and spring, and many more. But they were not an especially religious people. They had few temples and priests, and did not allow their superstition to influence their life or their politics to any great extent. We shall see that in a later age most of them deserted their pagan worship without much regret and after but a short struggle. It was more a matter of ancestral custom to them than a very fervent belief. It is noticeable that very few places in England get their names from the old gods, but we find a few, such as Wednesbury, Wodensbar, or Thundersfield, or Balderston, scattered over the face of the country.